Well, hello, good morning and good afternoon, depending on which continent you're in, and welcome to a multilateral solution for the DSI dilemma for Europeans and North Americans. My name is Michael Halewood. I work at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. That's one of the international agricultural research centers supported by the CGIAR. I've spent a good part of the last 20 years of my professional life focusing on access and benefit sharing issues, mostly from the ag sector, but of course there's a great deal of confluence between ag and environment on these issues, and one of the challenges is, of course, to overcome that sectoral divide as we go forward. The objectives of today's session are multiple. The first is to launch the DSI Scientific Network by hosting this event. And in so doing, we hope to expand the size of the network and to engage all of you in it in the longer term. We want to use this as an opportunity to offer perspectives of researchers and users of digital sequence information, to share their perspectives on their needs and their priorities regarding how access and benefit sharing linked to digital sequence information can affect their work and how it should affect their work in the future, assuming that we hit the right balance of rights and responsibilities. We want to provide policymakers and other scientists with an understanding of the importance of this issue to the research community in particular, and to raise red flags and green flags with respect to certain aspects of how norms developed at an international and national level can affect scientific research and development. And of course, overall, we really want to be contributing to the evolving discussion and to the body of knowledge and shared understanding, we hope, of some of the key issues that need to be taken into consideration as the international community moves forward over the course of the next months and years, thinking about how to deal with benefit sharing associated with the use of digital sequence information. The structure of today's event, in large form, will be to have two small table discussions. The first will be focusing on how digital sequence information is used, in particular by the four panelists we'll have speaking today, and how it is that they are being able to take advantage of, assemble, and use digital sequence information. The second panel will be looking at what they think are the critical elements to be included in access and benefit sharing mechanisms that might in the future be linked to digital sequence information. Prior to both of those panel discussions, we'll have short introductory overviews, both with respect to A, uses of digital sequence information in scientific research, and B, elements to be considered when thinking about multilateral approaches to access and benefit sharing for digital sequence information in particular. And that the focus here of the session really is on thinking through multilateral options for addressing this issue. Now, we have four panelists today. One is Christopher Lyle of the Natural History Museum. He is a taxonomist with over 40 years of experience in taxonomy, and he's worked on global biodiversity policy issues, in particular the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing, but also in the Global Taxonomy Initiative and invasive alien species. And he is the UK national focal point for the Global Taxonomy Initiative and a member of the CBD's Global Taxonomy Initiative coordination mechanism. We also have Raquel Hurtado Ortiz, who's with the National Collection of Cultures of Microorganisms from the Institut Pasteur in France. She's the head of the National Biobank of Microorganisms. She's a chemist, bacteriologist, parasitologist, and an active participant in working groups within the Ministry of Research Ministry of France regarding access and benefit sharing issues, and in the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. And she's an active member of the Budapest Treaty Forum, coordinated by the World Intellectual Property Organization. We have Amber Schultz from the Leibniz Institute, DSMZ in Germany. Amber Schultz is a deputy director of the Leibniz Institute, and she headed the team that led to the DMZ becoming the first registered collection under the Nagoya Protocol in the European Union. She's also the lead author of a combined study on digital sequence information in public and private databases and traceability that was submitted in January 2020 to the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Probably most of you have seen that paper. We also have Guy Cochrane from the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, the European Bioinformatics Institute. Guy is the head of the European Nucleotide Archive. And he's got a long experience also working on policy issues linked to access and benefit sharing, and in particular providing insights into the issues we're thinking about today, which is digital sequence information. So before I go any further, we'll have a note on logistics from the hosting team, and then a presentation by Amber on DSI uses and contributions to major DSI databases.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I'm just going to share some very short slides with all of you, just for some essential housekeeping that I suspect you're already familiar with from many of the other webinars you'd have attended by now, but just so that we're all on the same page. So first of all, this event is recorded. We do hope to be able to make the videos from all 4 regional webinars in the different languages available on the website of the DSI Scientific Network in the future. So that you know, we are recording. We will not be showing who attended the events, so you not personally will be visible, but just in case you are not comfortable with being part of a recorded event, you may now leave if that's something that's not okay with you. And otherwise, just so that you know. Questions to the panelists. I know that's probably what you're most interested in. So we will be managing the questions through the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen towards the right. You have a little Q&A icon. If you click on it, you can post questions. You will be able to see all the questions asked by participants, and you will be able to see all the answers provided either verbally, if they are answered verbally, or in writing by the panelists to these questions. We really encourage you to keep questions to the Q&A box so that we can manage the Q&A as efficiently as possible, and it makes it much easier for the chair to keep track of what's being asked and not to put the questions in the chat section, because then it becomes really difficult for us to track it into places. Some essential, I would say, quote unquote, ground rules. So please put the questions in the Q&A box, keep the chat for other comments, interactions that you want to have with other participants. We will also try to answer as many questions as we can, but depending on how many there are, we may run out of time. So we apologize in advance if that's the case. So we'll try our best, and it is possible that we might try to combine questions that are about the same topic to try to answer them as a group, if that makes it faster to address most of you. As per usual rules for these kind of online sessions, we would ask you to comment and to write with respect for all the participants and all the panelists. So comments or questions that contain foul or offensive language, slurs, insults, swear words, personal attacks to either the participants or to the panelists, which are clearly not related at all to DSI or ABS, will be in the dismissed section, as well as anything containing spam links. I'm sure you're all familiar with these ground rules. The point here is to keep a respectful environment in which everybody feels comfortable participating in. And then you are welcome to pose your questions either under your own name or to choose to pose them anonymously if that's better for you. Either one is perfectly fine. I think that's it for the ground rules. So that was very short. Any challenges, technical challenges, please drop a note in the chat, and my team and I will do our best to help you get back online or listen to us properly. Thank you, Michael. Okay, so the next stage in this process, we'll have Amber give a short overview on the ways in which DSI is used, and also to say something about the network, the DSI network.
Thanks, Michael. Hello to everyone. Nice to see you all here today. Unfortunately, on the other side of the camera, but we're glad that you're here. I'd like to give a brief overview of what the heck this network is that we're hosting today. So the DSI Scientific Network was founded in November 2020. It has currently 36 members from 16 different countries, representing every continent except for Antarctica. Our members are DSI providers, users, and researchers. And in order to join the network, you basically have to agree to the network's mission and its goals. And so all 36 of us have said, our mission is to contribute to policymakers and other stakeholders' understanding of DSI. That's our primary mission, as well as its applications and contributions to research supporting biodiversity conservation and public health, and the global benefits of open access to DSI databases. Our goal is that we recognize that finding a solution that balances the value of open access for researchers with the importance of benefit sharing, including monetary benefits, is and will be essential to deliver a global biodiversity framework that meets the priorities of different stakeholders and contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, that's kind of the network in a nutshell, and I will, over the course of the slides, also sort of point to different conversations that we've had amongst network members. So before we go any farther, I'd like to just provide a little bit of orientation. It's always hard to know in these webinars what the starting point is. And so some of you, of course, will be experts. You can close your eyes now. And some of you might be coming immediately from other sectors of policy or direct from the lab bench, so to speak. And perhaps this context is helpful for you. So why is there a call for benefit sharing from DSI? And the simple place to start is to acknowledge that there has been an explosion in sequencing since the Nagoya Protocol was negotiated. Remember, it took, I think, over a decade to actually reach the conclusion of the Nagoya Protocol in 2010. And during that time period, it would have been very difficult for negotiators to really see what was coming ahead. Now, if they were deep in the middle of practicing scientists at the time, they might have seen this trend coming. But we certainly know that the explosion, the exponential growth of sequence data has revolutionized the life sciences in the past decade. Furthermore, it hasn't just been the explosion of sequence data, it's also been corresponding parallel advances in biotechnology, specifically synthetic biology, and most importantly, in the last few years, gene editing. So perhaps many of you are familiar with the 2020 Nobel Prize in Medicine being awarded to 2 women for the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors approach that allows highly efficient and effective gene editing at the level of individual nucleotides. And in parallel, I always find this table to be really helpful. So on the left are different tools that you need to be able to do in silico synthetic biology. And in the columns are the different types of organisms that you might wish to manipulate. And you can see, based on the number of stars, how good scientists are at doing that right now. So you can see, for example, that not all columns have 3 stars, which means there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But you can also see there's a fair amount of 3 stars. And this implies that our reliance on physical access, in-country access to genetic resources, has fundamentally undergone a paradigm shift in the last decade. And so countries that are parties to the CDD that agreed to the deal negotiated in 2010 are saying, wait a minute, we signed up to something that fundamentally relies upon physical access to genetic resources. And now the science has moved the goalposts. The system is different than it was. And we really believe that the public access to sequence databases creates the ability to, or creates a loophole in this agreed to access and benefit sharing framework. And so we'd now like to know whether or not there is a way to enable benefit sharing from digital sequence data. And that's where this debate begins. However, the data ecosystem around DSI is not like the Nagoya Protocol, in our opinion. And here's a couple of highline statistics that I think are helpful to capitalize on that idea. So there are about 263 million sequences in the databases from every country in the world. In fact, if you look at the short read archive, so low quality sequences, you come up to about 1.5 trillion, yeah, a lot of zeros. The entire DSI data set is downloaded 34 million times a year. And I'm not talking about individual sequences, I'm talking about the whole set, the 263 million. So multiply 263 million times 34 million in your head real quick. And then it's used by 10 to 15 million users in every country in the world. Then this data is also automatically promulgated downstream to 2,000 databases. It is cited, reused, recycled in about 500,000 publications and patent applications. But most importantly, beyond the technical details, it requires comparison in order to understand. And so I've put a beautiful picture. We had an African webinar earlier today about a lion sitting there somewhere in the Serengeti. And when you look at that, either with or without binoculars, you're pretty sure that's a lion, right? You have a pretty good context for that. However, when you look at the picture on the right, you probably don't know what that means. I don't either. Why? Because the only way that you can understand TG, ACAT, TG, GGT is to compare it to other sequences and to build upon the information of sequence data that's already been published by somebody else and been analyzed by somebody else, and figure out how your piece is similar or different at which positions in the long, long chain of sequences. And that's a fundamental difference to the world of genetic resources. So what I'd like to do now is to take you on a little tour of use and provision of DSI by looking at a subset. So these are data based upon 9 million sequences that were cited in 118,000 open access publications where it was possible to do text mining. What we did is we took the literature and we basically scanned through them with automated methods. So we have a virus here, we have the author information in which there is also author affiliation information, and we can find out where the author was geographically located when this article was produced. And so this, in this case, was Peru. We use an algorithm to scan and look for unique identifiers, such as this number up here in the upper right, AF307324, and then use a lookup method to go back into the sequence databases and ask what was the country of origin for this sequence. And you can find this field that has the /country information. And so in this case, it was Brazil. This then leads to a table of results that, for this example, would say the providing country is Brazil and the using country is Peru. And once you've done that for a lot of sequences and a lot of publications, you can create network diagrams like these. So I've taken Raquel's host country, France, and shown you the use and providing patterns for France. There are 119 countries that are using French DSI, to which France is the providing country. You can see that one of its close allies and neighbors, Austria, is using its DSI, as well as Portugal, another European, but also Argentinian and South African scientists and Nigerian scientists are using French DSI. Brazil as well, Oman, these researchers are using French DSI. French scientists, looking at the reverse direction, so somebody like Raquel, for example, are using DSI from 186 countries. Again, you see a global distribution pattern up here in European countries, down here, East Europe being represented, Asia, South America, etc. You see here again, if you have the numbers in mind, French being on balance, somewhat more of a using country, but of course still significantly providing DSI. We had yesterday an Asian webinar. So India would traditionally consider itself a provider country. There are 94 countries, about half of the world is using Indian DSI. Again, another continent like Brazil, Japan using DSI, Vietnam, as well as, again, many different European countries, and of course, Americans. The Indian scientists, on the other direction, are using DSI from 150 countries. And so although traditionally one might think of India as a provider country, in this case, you see that Indian scientists are dominantly, comparatively, if you will, users rather than providers based upon this data set. We had an African panel this afternoon, and one of my colleagues spoke about the Algerian perspective and her use of DSI. A smaller country, North Africa, 35 countries are using Algerian DSI. As you can see that the amount shrinks down here, but again, still very international usage of Algerian DSI, ranging all the way over here to the Marshall Islands. Algerian scientists are using DSI from 20 countries, so a slight tendency towards being a provider country. Again, you see Africa over here as well as Eastern Europe. Many different global patterns from each of these different countries. Yesterday evening, we had a webinar with Latin America. We have 30 countries that are using Guatemalan DSI. We heard a lot about our Guatemalan scientist representative talking about the importance of sequencing and DSI, particularly for Guatemala's fight against COVID-19. And one important lesson that we see with Guatemalan patterns is that Guatemalan scientists are using DSI from 8 countries. Dividing pattern of DSI. So from each of these 4 countries, I hope you can see that the equations change in each of them, that in some cases it's sort of turned on its head, but that every country that we presented here today, and we look at the data, even small island states, both provide and use DSI. With that, I'd like to thank colleagues, including Guy Cochrane that's here today, as well as my co-lead on the Wild DSI project, Jens Freitag, and great collaborators across IPK and here at the DSMZ. And with that, we'd like to take a break in the slides and hear from distinguished colleagues.
Right.
Back to you, Michael.
Right. Thanks, Amber. Yeah, that sets the scene nicely for the first panel. The first panel is on the DSI user experience. And here we want to look at, and we're going to lay the foundation by getting some feedback from our panelists about how they use DSI and the kinds of benefits that their use of DSI helps to generate. And then in the next panel after this, with the same panelists, we'll get into, again, how they think an ABS system could be structured to help share the benefits that are generated through the work that they're engaged in. To Raquel, and ask the question, how do you use DSI, and what matters to you as a researcher in your use of DSI?
Hello to everyone. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this event. So yes, well, I will explain a little bit the activities of the collections. The activities that, for example, I realized. So these activities are of collections of microorganisms, also known as microbial biobanks, for example, both public collections, but also collections that are subject to specific regulatory frameworks, for example. These activities are focused on the use of biological material, but also on the utilization of the information associated with this material. So this associated information can be information about the origin of the biological material, or information related to microorganisms such as genomic sequences, metabolic profiles, biochemical profiles, etc. So this information is used, in our case, to characterize microorganisms. So I'm talking about, for example, bacterial taxonomy. By comparing such information with different databases. So for example, to identify bacterial species, we need to compare the genomes isolated and analyzed in our laboratories with other genomes available in different databases. So the way we classify and name microorganisms is changing very quickly, as you know. And as a researcher, I think it's really important to be able to have free and rapid access in order to perform an accurate characterization of microorganisms. So I say free access because if these databases, which for example contain genomes of bacterial species already described, were not able, it would be impossible to check these genomes, and we would not be able to identify new species that could be newly isolated. And why do I say fast access? Because there are, for example, specific laboratories, such as national reference centers that must do a rapid identification of microorganisms that are being isolated to detect possible epidemic outbreaks of strains or variants of importance in public health. So we have to remember that during the first weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was possible to develop the necessary diagnostic diagnostic tools, thanks to the availability of the genomic sequences of different viruses that were being isolated in different parts of the world. And on the other hand, as we well know, the World Health Organization has classified, for example, antimicrobial resistance as one of the top 10 threats to public health. And in fact, the next pandemic is expected to be caused by a new respiratory pathogens or multi-drug resistant strains. And in these cases, again, free and fast access to genomic sequences, to genomic sequence information is really essential to be able to respond quickly in an epidemic event like this, for example.
Okay, I'd like to ask Amber the same question, but before doing so, I just want to flag, Raquel, you said free access a couple of times, and I think that's an issue we're going to have to come back to when we talk about elements that can be included in a multilateral system for access and benefit sharing. I think the extent to which something is free or access is enabled or facilitated is one of the hot button issues we've got to come to when we get to the second roundtable. Amber, could you share a bit more about your experience as a user of DSI and what's important to you?
Yeah, I mean, this, unfortunately, Raquel and I come from the same field, from microbiology, so we have a bit of overlap here. So I tend to work more on environmental organisms, and she works more on pathogens, but yet a lot of what she said would be relatively repetitive. But I also think it might be helpful to pull in, other organisms of which I don't have direct personal experience with, but I was really inspired by examples from African colleagues today. There's one that sits in mind. He was talking about looking at traditional African tubers and using the watermelon genome to be able to design barcoding primers. And he noted that it really created the opportunity not only for efficiency, but also in a resource limited country, that he was able to quickly identify sections of conservation, of sequence similarity in the watermelon genome to these tubers, these traditional African tubers, without needing necessarily to sequence the tuber genomes, which are big and complicated and expensive. He could use the reference genome of the watermelon. I have no idea, because I thought watermelon was not that related, but okay. I'm not the plant person. That's what I said. So take it with a grain of salt, and allowing him to sort of leapfrog ahead. And I think that's an incredible opportunity to sort of show this interconnectedness. I'm sure that the watermelon genome researchers knew their data would be reused, but did they ever guess that it would be used for African tuber, monitoring? Probably not. And that's the cool thing about science, is that unexpected use and reuse pattern.
Yeah, I think all of us on this panel, or all of you on this panel, are involved in research that requires the gathering and comparison of an enormous amount of data. And I'd like to ask Guy now, I mean, what makes it possible for you to gather and manage that kind of data? What has to be in place for you to be able to do that?
So thanks very much to the organisers for putting the session together. And thanks for the invitation. So I think the starting point is that digital sequence information arise from effectively a platform, or a set of different platforms, but fundamentally the information that arises, the data set that arises, is very intercomparable, and sequence data look the same, whether they come from microbes, whether they come from eukaryotes, plants, animals, and so on. So you end up with a data type that is very comparable, and one can integrate those data into resources in a very straightforward way. The fact that one needs the kind of searches and the comparisons that Raquel and Amber have told us about, the fact that users need to make these comparisons across large numbers of sequences has really driven the processes that put these data into collections and make those collections available. And one has the opportunity to integrate the data, fundamentally a single data type. And then one has the opportunity then to search those data to compare new sequence and to contrast new sequence. And so there is, since the beginning of sequencing, there is a tradition of sharing sequences and putting them into collections. There are public databases that do this. And that infrastructure has become, over the decades, this has become a really important foundation for much of the genomics-led science that we now do. So we have global systems that exist that are useful for making the kinds of comparisons that we heard about. They rely on the fact that the data are very intercomparable in essence. And those systems are offered freely to scientists, and scientists have come really to value those enormously.
Okay, and Chris, maybe for you, do you have anything to add to that in terms of make what's possible and what makes it easier or less easy to manage the kind of data that you need to do? Maybe you could say a few words about the data you use if it's different than that the other speakers have been talking about.
It's probably not wildly different, but I think I would obviously echo what Guy says, and also add that there's a lot of data out there because a large number of people have been very, very assiduous at gathering it and publishing it. There's a wide agreement by journals, by science, that data, particularly nucleoside sequence data, but other DSI, should be made available through open access by agreed repositories. So you've got a known place to look. You've got hopefully a sustainable place to look, so you can put your data there and know it's going to stay there. And of course encourages further submissions, nothing that succeeds like success. So you can put your data where you know somebody else is going to be going to look for it. And this is based on an understanding that this sort of open access to data provides a resource for everybody to use. And I'll go back to my global taxonomy initiative hat. So the CVD parties many years ago called for a global taxonomic information system. And that's been repeated several times in COP decisions. It's in the HE targets in terms of data being made available. And they wanted this not because it was a scientific great thing to have, but it was there as a tool to help the CBD be implemented. And what we have with these global repositories, is open access repositories, is really part of that. And it's a basis for CBD implementation. So yeah, I use DSI particularly for identification, but also for looking for relationships between insects. And I'll come back to that. But it's that whole paradigm of sharing data and making it available, and making it available for wider use.
Right, thank you. I see we have some questions coming in. One from Edward Hammond. I think maybe I can paraphrase it as such. On the data that was presented by you, Amber, I guess the question is, how representative is this of the INSDC data that's available, and what are the 34 complete database downloads for, and what are companies doing the full database downloads how are they using this data? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing. This is a very long question.
No, you're doing a good job reacting in real time. A moderator's job is difficult. No, these are really important questions. So there's a number of technical details that need to be considered. When you use really large data sets, you're always going to be faced with the dilemma that any scientist has, that perfection is the enemy of progress. So if you say, well, I'd like to have every single publication that's ever cited DSI, well, then the way that you do that is you have to buy expensive commercial software to be able to get the closed access publications. And since the Wild DSI project and the Scientific Network both have a commitment to open access, it made sense for us to limit ourselves to what the general public was limited to and to stay with the open access publications. But as a result, you miss data. Yeah, that's just a compromise that you have to take in. In looking at the data where there is country information available, there about 16% of the global data set in the INSTC has country of origin information available in it. We know within the CBD study, when we looked at it, that about 43% of sequences that should have country information do not have them in there. There is a gap in terms of scientific reproducibility that needs to be filled, that can be filled, that requires, I think, changes in scientific behavior. So there is room for improvement. At the same time, the thing that I'm really proud about this study is that, to my knowledge, nobody's done it before. You might call 8 million small, you might call 118,000 publications minimal. At the same time, it's a lot more than none. And so I'm really interested in understanding what possible trends are out there and whether or not they provide hypotheses, ideas that can provoke further thought and analysis. And Ed is completely right. You want to go beyond this data set and you want to bring in more data. We would love, for example, to do these analyses with the patent literature and to figure out several questions, whether or not there are sequences that have been renamed, been given new unique identifiers, even though they originally came from the INSTC and they were renamed in patent applications and lost their geographical association. We want to be able to do sectorial analysis and figure out whether or not there are interesting trends in terms of which sectors these data are being used in public health, in conservation, in natural products, or whatever it might be. And you can do these with sophisticated software. The other important point are these downloads, right? The 34 million downloads a year, where the whole data set goes into somewhere. There are 3 locations where those 34 million downloads land. The first one is an obvious one. In databases that aren't Guy's. I mean, it's not Guy's database, but that aren't one of the 3 INSTC databases. They get spit out into other pooled, basically, if you will, and at very high frequency rates. You know, for example, the protein database wants to update itself pretty regularly. And that will account for a fair amount. The second place is academic institutes like mine. We download the INSTC database. We're a 200-person institute. We download it every 3 months, the full thing, because otherwise, if we always had to work with the database itself, the bandwidth over the firewall on the institute would create too much internet traffic. So we do that to have a fresh set every 3 months. But the most important point, and I'm sure where Ed's question is going, is yes, private companies are downloading the full data set. Often, it's not clear how much because we don't have that level of resolution. They're allowed, they should, and they would. And when we interviewed them, a number of different private companies for the CBD study, one interesting observation is that even though they might have a particular interest in, let's say, G protein coupled receptors, because those are really good targets for drugs, for example, they download all of the data set because they do not want competitor companies to track their internet usage and be able to figure out what kinds of things they're researching. And so they download the full data set as a matter of simplicity, let's say. This is also the critical point where the benefit sharing, especially monetary benefit sharing, kicks into play. So they download the public database, and eventually, let's assume they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders to make money. And they will, at some point, based on some portion of DSI use, make a commercial product. And in the CBD world the question is, should they have to pay something back for that use of the open data set? And that's where we are. Sorry for the long answer, Michael. You got me talking about databases. It's always the first mistake any moderator makes with me.
I have another question to paraphrase a little bit what I think Joseph Vogel is getting at. We're talking about DSI, but we haven't said what we think DSI is. And I'd like to sort of throw this open to any of you who want to answer. when we're talking about DSI right now, and I think you've all seen a very nice paper that was put together by the CBD Secretariat on conceptualization of different definitions of DSI. Where do you fit? Are you thinking of DSI as RNA and DNA? Are you thinking of it as metabolomics? Are you thinking of associated traditional knowledge? And where along that spectrum are you thinking of? What are you thinking of when you say DSI? Please, Chris.
I'll say what I'm thinking of. As a user, I'm thinking mostly about nucleotide sequence data, because that's mostly what I'm used and what my colleagues used. And of course, a number of the other concepts of DSI can spring from that nucleotide sequence data. When I start talking about benefit sharing and sort of the wider interest in DSI, I am moving more into the other concepts. As you recall, the 2020 RTEG of the CBD agreed 3 groups of DSI, and the first was nucleotide sequence data. The second was nucleotide sequence data plus so the genomics, the metagenomics, and the third was those two, including the proteomics was the second. The third was the metabolomics. The associated data, the information about those data was considered by the RTEG to be not DSI itself. And when the RTEG discussed associated traditional knowledge, it recognized that was extraordinarily important, but that was a separate focus of CBD action and did not consider that itself DSI. Not that it wasn't important, just that it wasn't DSI. So yeah, broadly, I'm talking about sequence data, but I will shift at some points into other data, and I trust I'll make that explicit, but I might not.
Do any of the other 3 of you want to answer this, or shall we move on?
I can
Sure, Chris.
make a quick point. So I think we have the luxury in this discussion being informal and not being a negotiation that we can we don't really, it's not our purpose to define what DSI is. But I think for me, because I believe that it is the accessibility of the collection of all DSI that has the value, and because it's also true that data derived from DSI or data derived from other platforms that study, enumerate biological molecules and characterize them, I think that all of this really needs the same treatment. It needs to be accessible holistically for analysis to lead to scientific and societal benefits. So I'm sort of saying I think that it shouldn't matter for us too much, because I think that the whatever it is, the openness and the accessibility for analysis is the same for the application of DSI.
Okay. Yep. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just fully 100% support Chris and Guy, and just to contextualize what they said and my full support for what they said. The reason that the networks, the network graphs and this data set that Guy and I worked on, as well as the CBD study, that we have put together them exclusively based upon nucleotide sequence data, is because it's a really heavy lift to come up with these data in the first place because of the size of the data set. We're trying to look at and analyze global data sets, but it is honestly and truly not with bias for the outcome of a political decision that is much beyond my scope. So the fact that these data that I just presented are based upon nucleotide sequence data is with zero bias for the outcome of somebody else's decision.
Okay, a question I think that maybe we can give to Guy has to do with, how does DSI help us understand ecosystems? Because these ecosystems are about innumerable relationships between species. How is DSI helping us with that? And so, indirectly, I guess, how does DSI help support conservation?
So one, I think of one example of how one uses DSI to explore ecosystems. There's a technique known as meta-barcoding, another technique known as metagenomics, where you apply sequencing anonymously to an environment. And what you do is you don't isolate any particular organism from an ecosystem. You just take all of the organisms and you sample them. What you can do with the sequence data that results, which is a mixture of lots of different bits of DNA from different organisms, you can process those, analyze those, and infer which species are there. And if you're doing metagenomics, you understand which genetic functions are there, and you can start to reconstruct virtual genomes, if you like, but you can start to reconstruct the kinds of biochemical processes that will be happening within those ecosystems, and start to look at how the ecosystem might be functioning, what kind of services it might be providing, how it might be interacting with the abiotic environment around it. In order to do those analyses, you have to do some sequencing. You take your sample, you do some sequencing. But of course, to understand everything, again, we come back to this need to compare and contrast with large collections of other sequences. And so what you do typically in these analyses is pick out a particular region, which is a good marker for different taxonomic groups, and you may use that to identify and list and profile the taxonomic groups that are present in your ecosystem. Or you may look at genes, so you may compare to lists of genes from lots of different organisms, so gene families, and work out which genes are present, what the abundance is, and how they might be working together. So that's just one example of DSI use that is at sort of ecosystem level and allows the reconstruction of the organisms and the functions that are in that ecosystem.
Yeah, and the benefits for everyone of that kind of knowledge is I think pretty obvious. Raquel, I'd like to ask you more or less the same question. What kinds of benefits are you generating that are of global relevance or public relevance from the kind of work you're doing?
Well, in general, the benefits, you mean? Yeah, well, the benefits could be, well, for researchers or for science. I mean, I think that these benefits we already talked about them. But in addition to that, we have other benefits. For example, the promotion of collaboration. We know that, for example, it allows the replication of previously made discoveries. So this, that is, it avoids redundancy of scientific research, which in turn will have an impact on the care of the national and global economy. So in this point, I would like also to highlight to talk about the topic about the money invest in science and technology, for example. So this money is a recurring, this investment is a recurring theme in all scientific and non-scientific forums. We always say that greater investment in science is needed, but however, I think that it is not all. I mean, this is not only about increasing financial investment in science and technological developments, but also regulatory frameworks that are needed to ensure that financing is used in the most effective possible way. So in this regard, scientific advances must be reproducible in order to build new knowledge from something already done. And this new knowledge will be used as long as the access of information is facilitated. So otherwise, the investment of money, which is often public money, for example, will be invested in vain without having results that return a profit, for example, to the country.
Okay. I'd like to wrap up this small table discussion, coming back to where we started, and that has to do with the difference between the way you're using genetic resources per se and the way you're using DSI in the research you're doing. Maybe Chris, can you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to stick with identifications for a bit. A few years ago, I did a an assessment of taxonomic capacity in the United States to identify or to manage invasive species. I did that with Scott Miller of the Smithsonian. And we were looking right across the board, how do people do this? So one thing they do is to, when they've got a thing, compare it with another thing in a collection. And to do that, you've got to go through an expert probably. You might use a field guide, which will get you so far, but actually ultimately for a real result, you need an expert. However, what a lot of people are doing, and these are not researchers, these are people in quarantine, they're people in park management, they're beginning to use the DSI library, the barcode library in particular, genetic barcode, that is freely available. It is a great thing to identify invasive species. And of course, the thing about invasive species is that they don't come from your country, which means that if you just do a DNA barcode library from where you are, it doesn't help you a whole lot. You need everybody else's. Going back to those show, the slides Amber showed, if you haven't got access to sequence data from other countries, you can't do that job. Now, there's loads of other ways in which sequence data are used. So for population studies, for example, impact of harvesting on genetic diversity, thinking of trees or forests, thinking of some of the wildlife. We've used, there's a whole study on populous Niger in the EU using genetic diversity. You can't do that with the thing, you've got to use the sequence data. DNA forensics on wildlife trade. If you've got a bit of burnt meat, how do you know what it is? How do you know where it came from? We've been using in planning conservation of wolves at the EU level. So lots and lots of things. Is it used enough? No, it's not. I think we've gone a long way with delivering sequence data and other DSI. I don't think we've gone far enough yet at ensuring that the benefits of that are fully realized around the world. And I think that's one of our big challenges, and that's sort of capacity building, which we may come on to later, to do with really making the most of what's going on at the moment and making people can in the way we want, we expect.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a nice way to wrap up this roundtable, because we will be looking at the next roundtable on elements to include in a multilateral system to leverage the benefits that can be derived and shared. But before doing so, we're going to have another presentation from Amber about multilateral options for benefit sharing.
Gotta make everything go again. Thanks, Michael. So we looked at individual use patterns in the network diagrams that we showed. And now what I'd like to do is to look at global patterns. So when you take all of the data that's displayed in those network diagrams, you can graph them on the X and the Y axis. So on the X axis, you have a country's use, the number of countries that a country uses from. And on the Y axis, you have provision, providing. And what the eye pretty naturally picks up is a nice linear trend. You can see that countries tend to be and are indeed both providers and users of DSI, and often in roughly equal patterns. So we saw again, India is different than Guatemala, but you see that both provide and use. And perhaps this doesn't intuitively surprise scientists, but I do think that this is not necessarily a trend that perhaps, for example, policymakers would necessarily have expected. So you see a big, very mega biodiverse country like Brazil over here, again, using more on the x-axis than providing in terms of the number of countries that it uses from. You can take this data and you can look at it a slightly different way. And you can ask based upon economic groupings to have really simple categories, because looking at 200 dots on a scatter plot is a little hard for the brain to process. So you can group these data into OECD countries, so high income countries on average, G77, low income countries, and sort of your middle income countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the first thing that's interesting is the biggest chunk in each column matches the country of origin for the DSI. So the user group matches, the biggest user group matches the country of origin. So looking here, OECD users use OECD data the most. And of course, this actually makes sense for us as scientists. It's easiest and much more common that we would do research in our own backyards or close regionally than that we would fly across an ocean to do research. So this is sort of intuitive. But you see, this pattern is also true for low and middle income countries, where the biggest amount of use is here and here as well for BRICS and G77 users. And this also reminds me personally that if we want sustainable use and if we want to have bioeconomy based development, that we need to encourage this kind of use from especially these users. You do still, however, see some really important differences. If you look at the sheer quantity of the DSI being used in the column on the right, you see that OECD DSI is used 3 times more than BRICS or G77 DSI. This is because there is a lot more OECD sourced DSI in the databases, and so of course it gets used more. But I would hypothesize that within the context of the global biodiversity framework, we actually want this trend to change. We want these gaps to be filled in, and I don't think that a restrictive access and benefit sharing regime would be the way to achieve that goal. Another important and final note is that there are 40% fewer publications from BRICS and G77 scientists than there are from OECD scientists. And again, I would hypothesize that as a global community, we also want this to change. So what does this tell us? Well, one of the things that the network members have been talking about a lot in the last 6 months is what a potential benefit sharing framework might look like. And what we've been talking about is a decoupled multilateral framework for benefit sharing. And what we mean by that is that although we access DSI from open databases, we actually think that the monetary benefit sharing mechanism must be decoupled from the database, that access has to be decoupled from databases. There are a number of different monetary mechanisms that could be considered, and we don't actually think that any one has at this point been shown to be better than the others. In fact, it might even be appropriate to consider multiple different mechanisms for monetary generation. But whatever it is, at the end of the day, it's pretty clear to us that it is only through an open database where all sequences are treated equally that you will not create perverse incentives where some sequences are used preferentially and others are avoided. In fact, we actually think that there's an opportunity here for the international community to create a virtuous cycle. One idea that we've had within the group is that you can use the information from the open databases for many different purposes, but potentially even to create a system of bonus payments from the multilateral fund for those countries that put more biodiversity data into the open databases. We think it's pretty clear that this fund can and should encourage capacity building, research and infrastructure, and directly relate to biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable use, as well as, of course, important aspects of the GBF, such as species monitoring and conservation. And ultimately, the goal, as you can see, is to create this positive feedback loop, increasing the use of DSI and increasing the amount of biodiversity-based DSI. Because we're a diverse group of DSI users and practitioners, we think that one central element of a benefit sharing framework will be to focus on capacity building, especially based on that last slide that I showed you. And that there is a true opportunity here for what we've been calling a leapfrog opportunity. We have, the great historical policy example of leapfrogging when cell phone service enabled many individuals in the developing world to access the internet in the absence of the infrastructure for fiber optic cables. That was called a leapfrog event. And I think actually, although it's a smaller field, the same thing can happen here in the DSI world. It is not necessary, if it's not possible in a resource limited country, it is not necessary for there to be a sequencing machine that costs $1 million in the basement of every single African institute or the server infrastructure for that. Instead, there's a leapfrog opportunity that those scientists with the right know-how and with the right training in genomics and bioinformatics don't need to have the direct in-house sequencing, but can learn and provide both to the bioeconomy, to biodiversity, to sustainable use, through being able to harness genomics and bioinformatics expertise. And with that, I would love to continue discussing with colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask a question that I had in the back of my mind with your first presentation. When you refer to data from a place or from a region, are you referring to this, that's where the data was generated, or are you referring to the underlying genetic resource that was sequenced that is the source of that information?
No, and referring to the country of origin in ABS speak. So truly to the country of origin, and if it's helpful, I can put the definition of that field in the databases in the chat so that we can talk about it. But I'm not talking about where the organism was sequenced. I'm talking truly about the country of origin. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good. So then, yeah. All right. Well, look, we're now going to move into our second panel, and the second panel is what should a benefit sharing mechanism for DSI look like? And that's what this is where the rubber hits the road, folks. And I'd like to start off with an open question to all of you. What should a benefit sharing mechanism for digital sequence information look like? What fundamental components should be part of such a system? And sorry, that's the billion-dollar question, but.
I can start if you wish. So for me, a benefit sharing mechanism for DSI should be a mixed mechanism that allows that advancement of research, of scientific research and innovation, but at the same time that allows the return of benefits for of the use of DSI to the place of origin of biological material, the origin, of biological material from which DSI come from. And above all, in which traditional knowledge is recognized due to the value it deserves, from which a large amount of information that is used today comes from also. So this mechanism must be a multilateral mechanism. So as the mechanism that Amber already showed, since the generation and use of DSI should not be restricted to developed countries, because the objective is that more and more developing countries become users, but also generators or producers of DSI.
Okay, so access, you're saying, should be arranged multilaterally, and capacity should be supported for more users to gain access, and access is in itself a benefit. What other elements of benefit sharing should be included in such a system? Assuming we all agree that the access part is multilateral and facilitated. Please, Chris.
Yeah, I'm gonna start on non-monetary, because one of the things we do need to do is to change the paradigm in which we work. And I think I've said this before, and it's been said a number of times recently. I think we all accept that at the moment there is a massive asymmetry across the world in ability to generate and use DSI, however you define DSI, and whether that's for non-commercial purposes or commercial purposes. We have got to level that playing field. That's got to be where we're going. So everything we do in terms of developing a novel benefit sharing system has got to bear that in mind, to think whatever we do cannot further disadvantage countries which are already disadvantaged. We don't want to drop things in the mechanism which break it, because the richer companies can make a workaround and the poorer countries will not be able to get a workaround. So we've got to level the playing field. We've got to do that through appropriate capacity development to really put in systems which are delivering against objectives. And that's going to be objectives for from the CBD, but of course national objectives, because this CBD operates through countries. Yes, there has to be a financial benefit sharing system as well. There's clearly no doubt about that. The countries around the world have made that very, very clear. Pragmatically, if anybody doubts that, we can see that countries, in their concern that monetary benefits be shared appropriately, are putting in tougher and tougher legislation. And they're going to carry on doing that. And it would be better, as I say, a paradigm shift to make sure benefits are shared rather than go through some sort of transactional thing. Oh, well, if you let me have that, I'll give you this. No, let's do it broad scale. So we want a functioning system that produces benefits but doesn't produce grit in the works, that doesn't damage what we're trying to build. Sorry, soapbox time.
One of the promises, and here I'll pull in some of my own experience under in the agricultural sector and plant genetic resources, since the early 80s, the promise has been that there should be access and benefit sharing, but one of the forms of benefit sharing should be capacity building, and that there should be the creation of an international fund to support that benefit sharing. But the fact is, the requisite amounts of money and support has never materialized. And what do you say to skeptics out there who say, a Northern research organization is telling me I should trust in benefit sharing, and yes, you did say monetary benefits are important too, but how do we move the needle on this? Because frankly, a lot of people have been saying for a long time the investment needs to be in benefit sharing to even things out, as you have, but we haven't delivered.
And there are two angles to that. One is accepting, as I said, a paradigm shift. Let's get our show on the road in a more mature fashion. If we recognize there's a biodiversity crisis, we've got to do something about it. And a lot of people are. I mean, things are happening, but they're happening often at very low levels. So if you enter into a benefit sharing arrangement as a scientist going into a country, you're training a few people, you're sharing information, but it's almost entirely below the radar. So the country doesn't necessarily know in an official way. Lots happens, it's not all visible. But more, I think our funding for science must be more explicit in terms of how the scientific research is used. And we have to look very carefully about how research is translated into delivery. A friend of mine once criticized taxonomy as producing problems and throwing them over a wall in the hope that a passing problem picked them up. We've got to get better at joining the dots, and that goes for capacity development as well as our scientific output.
Thank you. Guy, sort of moving on with the same theme, we have these monetary versus non-monetary benefits. What do you see as the best way to approach both? What's the balance we should be looking to strike here? Well,
so I'll start by saying that, I mean, we have to note that the monetary versus non-monetary relates to the sharing out of the benefits, not the generation of the benefits. Both capacity building and other forms of non-monetary benefit and direct funding, they both require funding at input stage. So really to follow up on what Chris is saying, if you really want to build the ability of the whole world to engage in the scientific process and to benefit from the scientific process, that will take investment from somewhere. And so we have to identify where the source of that investment is. And it does seem obvious that investment comes from the wealthier parts of the world and not. So there's a sort of obvious path to follow there. I think there has possibly been, I think we need to run the system for some time really to know the answer to this. But I think it's very likely that the commercial value that we will get from sequencing activities is insufficient to deliver the biodiversity solution that the world needs. So even though there are examples of cases where some genomics activity has led to some great breakthrough that's made a lot of money for a particular company or a particular group of people. Even though there are cases of that, the vast majority of sequences really are not part of any value chain like that. And there's a great deal of uncertainty. So one question I would ask is, well, what is the total value in the system? What revenue can be raised by genomics or DSI activities alone? And I think that, you know, perhaps we'll run this for 20 years and find out there is a huge value and it's enough. But it will be very bursty. There'll be periods of very little. It will be very unevenly distributed around the world. There'll be countries who for the first 10 years never have any DSI that produce any commercial value. So what do you so those countries have to wait for that period of time. So I think we have to recognize that this is an issue where we do need to raise funds to solve the problem. Some of those funds may come from commercialization activities of DSI. I think at least in the first instance, some of those funds need to come from elsewhere to make this work. And then I think we need really to step back a little on the non-monetary benefits and really assess what has happened so far and what's happening now, because I think a lot of things are happening informally, as Chris says, that really don't get tracked and captured, and together perhaps this isn't a great deal, but perhaps it is, and perhaps there are lessons in there about what works well and what genuinely helps. So I would like to think that the future involves, whether we do this directly through the monetary benefit route or the non-monetary route, I would like to think that the future involves a larger representation around the world in not just the science around DSI, but also in the process of managing the DSI, running the systems that distribute the DSI, doing the curation work, doing all of the database work that is currently done by a small number of institutions in a small number of countries, really having that as a global activity. And I think this is a really important part of it, that there can be global responsibility and global benefit by being part of the overall system that distributes and derives value from DSI.
A little bit of what you said creates the basis for a link to another ongoing discussion, which is, of course, the post-2020 framework, Global Biodiversity Framework. And you probably have seen the drafts. Most people attending this webinar will, and you'll have noted that under Goal 3 and Target C, having to do with access and benefit sharing, there is this promise that the international community will be able to somehow measure financial, monetary, and non-monetary benefits, but that the indicators for that are pretty skinny at the moment. There clearly needs to be a certain amount of work done on that. You think this is a moment in time in which we should be simultaneously contributing to that conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, if not now, then when? I mean, this is the opportunity. DSI isn't being negotiated in its own little lonely boat, but it's part of the global biodiversity framework. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. The cool and lucky thing about DSI, you know, depending of course on its definition, is unlike for genetic resources, there actually is a global infrastructure where we can get data on what's happening, right? And that doesn't exist for genetic resources. So there's already like a great step forward there in terms of being able to count stuff. And data continues to be liberated. I mean, this is the trend du jour of the decade, is that data will continue to be liberated and can be better connected. There are platforms within the OECD that funding agencies release the amount of different of the public grants that are made available, ranging from the European Union to the US National Science Foundation down to the Argentinian grants. And if you can connect the value of an academic grant to the research output to the DSI that was generated, you can start to make these connections. So it is possible. And I think that's what has to happen here. And it has to be directly tied, in my opinion, also to capacity development, to matchmaking. I mean, just really start to get smart and not to be, 10 years behind the curve this time. And Michael, if you'll allow me, because I know I had the slide on the multilateral framework, but if I could come back to the what I wish for in a access and benefit sharing mechanism, it also touches on a couple of the questions actually. Somebody asked, how should the funds be used, for example? And I don't necessarily think that it's the job of DSI users and scientists to tell policymakers what their political priorities should be. I do think that it is our job to say what the data say, to analyze it well and smartly. And what's clearly being shown from the bar graph that I showed, and what's also relatively common sense, is that there are gaps and there are opportunities. And that these gaps, through well-targeted international collaboration efforts, can actually move the needle. And that's our job as scientists, is to say, hey, look over here, policymakers, there's something happening that you could do something about if you consider this a political priority. Now, if funds should be used exclusively for conservation and sustainable use projects, you know, on a rolling basis, I don't want to get into that because I feel like that's a negotiation question. But we can certainly tell you, A, species loss is real, it's happening. B, we don't know all the species that exist on the planet. We should learn that. And C, there are real gaps, but genomics and bioinformatics is a great place to make a real investment because it is changing the world. And then on a final point, if you'll allow me, this question of commercial use, the idea that we're saying that only academic public good research happens with DSI. Nobody said that. That's not true. That's our job. That's what we do here. And that's what members of the DSI network do. But we're not asking industry to hide behind us and say, oh, don't look over there. There's nothing over there. No, of course, industry uses it. They have a fiduciary duty to make money and they use sequence data. Make the connection. It's true. Commercial use of DSI happens. And the fundamental dilemma is, how do you not throw the baby out with the bathwater? How do you do both? How do you keep this strong ecosystem running? And how do you ensure that the fundamental promise of access and benefit sharing can happen and keeps happening? And that's why we're stuck with. And that's what our suggestion to the world right now is: you don't have to do access and benefit sharing. You can do access and benefit sharing. You can decouple and you can create virtuous cycles. And we're saying, yeah, I think all of us think outside the box.
Yeah, what you're describing, of course, is very similar to the logic and the structure of the multilateral system of access and benefit sharing under the Plant Treaty. And anybody who knows me is probably waiting for me to have said this some time ago. It was on the basis of the fact that countries are interdependent on their use of plant genetic resources, that it is hard, often to trace back to countries of origin, that the extremely high rate of exchange of plant genetic resources is fundamental and international, and we can see that looking at the trends in the use of genetic resources. That was the logic behind the creation of the multilateral system of access and benefit sharing, and that does decouple access from benefit sharing. Benefit sharing is done through a multilateral system. There, we have a benefit sharing formula that had to do with: you incorporate something into a new product, you commercialize the product, it's not available for research and breeding, you make a payment to a fund. Obviously, given the number of payments that have been made into the fund, the formula isn't correct, and so there have been explorations into how to change that. Nonetheless, the question is still: what is the trigger in a multilateral system that you can use to leverage to get the payments from the commercializers? And the treaty, it was moving from that formula to maybe something like a library system where people who access the system would make payments based on, in our case, it was a smaller sector, seed sales of companies. It was a finite number of users, but there was still a lever, and the international community was focusing on that, moving in that direction, and the negotiations are suspended. I'd like to ask you, what are those levers when you're looking at commercial benefits that can be derived from commercial use? How do we approach that?
Michael, we're all really proud that you were able to make it an hour and 15 minutes without saying the Plant Treaty. So first of all, hats off. But I don't think that anybody, maybe Chris, Raquel, Guy, you guys are smarter than me, this is likely. But I don't think that we have quite the perfect answer. And I do think that another topic that's come up, but please, colleagues, complete my thoughts. I don't think that the international community has quite the answer to this. I really do expect, and I hope, and I plead to policymakers that there's a very well-informed intersessional period or periods that explore that point, if there is convergence on benefit sharing and there's convergence on open access, that can develop that in more detail, because if you screw that question up, where the commercial trigger is and how, then you can make a lot of bad things. You can cause a lot of bad things, and you can make it really hard to undo them. But I don't know, Chris, Guy, Raquel, give other opinions if you disagree.
No, I mean, it is very difficult. Experience with the EU ABS regulation, which has a trigger for a declaration at a commercial point, has a number of points at which that's triggered. So it may be seeking approval, formal approval for something to go on the market, it may be placing something on the market, and so on and so on. Now that was decided at the EU level, and it's being translated into the UK as well, because we've kept that bit of legislation. But even that negotiation to create the legislation was challenging. And if you're looking for a trigger which every country will accept or agree to or implement, and I think it has to be implement because we've got businesses working all over the world, we're into a really difficult point. If you use the patent system, well, not everything's patented. Not every patent, even if you can work out what DSI or genetic resources went into it, you don't know what contribution they made to the thing which is patented. There are some real challenges in finding that point. The logical move on from that is to either go for some sort of flat rate that everybody puts in, or that comes from some other mechanism, so it is fully decoupled from the use of DSI. There will be a question there about what is fair and equitable. I know that one of the people writing on the chat, Joseph Vogel, has been talking about economic rents, and I confess I do not understand that, but nonetheless there are maybe economic models out there that should be investigated. They're way beyond my skill set. Another proposal that has been made is as of a purely voluntary structure, where users put in what money they feel appropriate, or maybe there's some sort of level put in. And an incentive for that is to be visible as doing the right thing, the green tick on the product. But as you say, Amber, I think that detail at the financial level is beyond our skill area, our expertise, and it will be difficult to go too far that way.
Yeah, the question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the question
No,
is.
please go ahead.
Not, it's not easy to answer, but in this sense, I wanted to add, talking about, for example, commercial use and the patents, that in fact, in practice, we know that not all genomic sequences used in patents are always disclosed. So only some of them that are the most important sequences are disclosed because of the confidentiality framework that protects information, etc. So in this case, I think that there is a balance, in both forms of due diligence. If we compare, for example, the information, the commercial use against, for example, research in general.
Raquel, I'll ask you this question, but others, please jump in if you have an opinion. But we're talking right now about a multilateral approach to access and benefit sharing for DSI, linked in many cases to genetic resources that are themselves the subject of bilaterally oriented access and benefit sharing regulations. How do you see the relationship between those two things? You're going to have data associated with a resource that's multilateral and the resource itself bilaterally oriented. How do you bring these two regimes together?
I'll bring the two regimes together. So yeah, well, it's quite a little bit what I was proposing for this scheme, or this way of benefit sharing. well, we already have experienced something about, for example, with Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing using biological materials. So we already experienced some difficulties in the application of Nagoya Protocol with the microorganisms. I mean, for example, in biobanks or collections. But it has been difficult, for example, to obtain information from many countries and etc. So yeah, both types of both schemes should be, if we mix them, they have the same. They have to allow research in a way, and to ensure the benefit sharing or the profit, the return of profit in the other way.
So I think, if I can make a comment, so there are fundamental differences between data and physical materials. So one is the physical materials are expendable, data are not. DSI can be replicated thousands of times around the world. This is a straightforward transaction. Physical materials as well require significant efforts, or significantly more efforts, to be communicated, to be moved around. So imagine some data science applications. Imagine machine learning, where you need a large training. How do you apply machine learning to physical materials? How do you do a similarity search across lots of different physical materials? These things are fundamentally quite different. That's not to say that they necessarily have so they're part of a chain. Of course, the DSI represents the physical material, but I think we're dealing with things that are conceptually very, very different. And so having a single model that deals with both of those effectively may not, because we're dealing with such different challenges. But I think certainly access to materials becomes, in some cases, when people are using DSI, it becomes the next step. And so leading on from some piece of scientific work based solely on data, one can say, well, in fact, now we need access to this strain or this organism. We need to culture it and do this experiment. Now that, of course, brings in this scenario of two different systems, it brings us across to the system applied to the say a bilateral system applied to physical materials. But also it's the introduction of scientists to other scientists who are holding those materials, to the people perhaps who collected them, to the natural history collection in a different country. So I think there can be also opportunities in transitioning from the data domain into the physical material domain.
Was that your hand up, Amber?
If you want me, but you could also go on if you want.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, this also relates to some of the threads that are going in the Q&A as well. It's hard to keep your mind in both and to pay attention to your presence and the others and that. But one fundamental idea that we have discussed is this idea of perverse incentives. So a colleague, for example, is saying in the Q&A, the plant treaty doesn't work, but it's multilateral. So why would you do multilateral again, for example? Or there's another question about, universal mechanisms for DSI. Or your question was, how are physical genetic resources different from DSI and these kinds of things? I think the lesson that we can learn from the Nagoya Protocol, and even actually from the multilateral ITP-GRFA system, is that the bigger the set of stuff is under which the benefit sharing mechanism creates, the less competition there is for that stuff relative to other stuff. What I mean by that is, in the Nagoya system, the Nagoya Protocol system, you have a bilateral system. So basically every country competes for users and says, hey, conditions, maybe they don't realize this, but they're saying, hey, conditions in country X are easier than country Y. So me, biodiversity researcher, I go there because it's easier. A plant treaty, okay, well, if there's other plants that don't have benefit sharing requirements on them, that I preferentially use those instead of these because, well, that's easier, better for me, right? And so same thing when you talk at an even different multilateral level about if CBD world and plant world and UNCLOS world all come up with their different DSI regimes, well, then those will all compete with each other. So what you really want to do, I think, if we're talking about like fundamental transformative change of ABS, is to think as big, broad, blanket as possible and say, this is the world of ABS, and here is where benefit sharing kicks in. And if that data set can or will compete with others, then it will be a competition between what the other one conditions are. And so if you do a bilateral system in DSI, I guarantee you there will be a huge boom in American sourced DSI, great for the Americans, but it will just compete with the countries that put conditions on it. You might think you're a mega biodiverse country and you have the best DSI ever, but I'm telling you, that will really fundamentally create competition. So I think the challenge to policymakers is to create a non-competitive system, and that is the only system that will actually deliver real benefit sharing.
So this is a plea for us to get out of our sectorial silos and come up with a truly global.
Yeah, even though it's really hard.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Chris, you're smiling. Do you have? Oh, sorry, Raquel.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, in this sense, I had also the impression that it could be that these genetic resources from, for example, from developing countries would be less used, no? If we already experience all the difficulties regarding biological material with the Nagoya Protocol, if we apply the same to DSI, I had the impression that, that maybe that information from developing countries will be less used, less sequenced, for example, biological material. So there would be less information about in databases, and I mean the objective is for those countries is to have benefit from this from the use of these resources. So in that case would be if there is less information available, but the benefit will be also less.
Sorry, Chris, I was going to point at you because I saw you were nodding your head and smiling at the last.
Well, yes, I was agreeing with Amber. I think there's a concomitant to this. If all DSI is in one pot, even if all terrestrial DSI is in one pot, and we look for some form of multilateral benefit sharing system, which I think we all agree is the least damaging and most likely to succeed. One of the bits of grit in the wheel is is track and trace. If you do that, as Guy would say, I think that this risks just slowing the machine, slowing our ability to use the machine. If you don't do that, then you're opening up the possibility that we're looking at monetary benefit sharing of DSI that originated from countries which currently do not require benefit sharing to take place for their genetic resources. The UK, for example, we've got no access legislation, so anybody can come and get what they want. And we're now saying, well, actually, if the DSI from UK is in the system, then benefit sharing should take place from that. The UK may not be a particular concern here, and I suspect the UK would say, yeah, that's fine. I'm not an American. I don't know how the USA will react to that, for example, and what that would mean for an overall system or an overall repository. So I think there's a policy line to be explored there. I would hope that every country says, yeah, this is possible. But I suspect that if we go for a benefit sharing system which requires high payments from particular industries, it might cause more of a problem than a benefit sharing system which requires some sort of flat rate, which might be relatively low. So I think there's an interesting route to tread there in examining how this might work.
Another benefit of taking these things to scale, of course, is that the payments, the larger the range of potential payors you have in the system, the lower the payments could be. So in the food and agriculture sector, if you get past plant breeding companies and you get to food companies, suddenly you've opened up a whole new universe of potential payors, and so the rates could go down exponentially. And how do you account for this, the difference in sectors? I mean, in terms of how you approach this global united scale or system that you have in mind, or that Amber, you proposed at least.
Can I just shove it into the intersessional period?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, nobody wants to tax your food, right? People need to eat. That's like a really hard thing to convince any government with taxpayers and voters to swallow. I mean, come on. Okay, so if we can leave the carrots and the cucumbers alone, right? Then my kids have a good argument why they don't have to eat the cucumbers, because it costs mommy more money, you know, like that. We're gonna have to be really careful with that space. It's just how humans work. But the attractiveness of really truly decoupling and putting simple systems in place that cover very broad swaths of ABS obligations that create universal systems is extraordinarily attractive and smart. It's the right thing to conduct sound economic analysis upon. It's the right thing to do true cost benefit analysis on. It's the right thing for people with political smarts to negotiate into the middle of the night. I get it intuitively. You're absolutely correct. I mean, like I said, there have to be like reasonable boundaries about taxing food. Like, nobody cares if you tax first-class airline tickets, right? Because, okay, yeah, we can socially accept that. I think taxing carrots is hard. But clearly this idea of simplicity and decoupledness and big, broad swaths is incredibly compelling, yes.
Yeah, well, I think taxing food at the level of the consumer is of course, a pretty perilous proposition. Taxing some of the biggest food companies in the world, I think, would be harder to argue against, but yeah.
Yeah, good point, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just to take a step back, now I know these two regions that are participating in this call are perhaps two of the least likely regions to be championing at the level of the CBD a strong monetary benefit sharing schema. And maybe just to put the shoe on the other foot, what are your concerns? What could go wrong here? If we push this too hard? And we've been talking about a multilateral system as the light touch, perhaps, but even a multilateral system has its perils, and there will be skeptics who say even that's not possible. What do you say to them? There'll be many people who say that this journey, we shouldn't even start down this road. What do you say to them?
We're on a journey somewhere. I hope that the end of the journey, or the result of the journey, is improved conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. I hope that the journey also produces greater equity across peoples and across nations. And I think I would imagine that all of our participants would agree on those as important, valid, vital places to go. And the question is how you get there. Arguably, after two sets of decadal targets on biodiversity, haven't really achieved a hell of a lot. Apologies to those who have done a lot. We need to change what we're doing and how we do it. I think that this is part of that journey, part of the way in which we change what we do and how we do it. Yep, multilateral is difficult. Bilateral is more difficult, I think. The details of that multilateral, I'm sorry, my brain is only so large, it can't encompass it all, but we have a lot of expertise listening to us right now. We have a lot of expertise on the panel. We have a huge amount of expertise elsewhere. that is increasingly engaged in this problem. And I think if we make the best use of that, we can find a way through, because I think we all want to go to the same place.
We're rapidly running out of time, but I'd kind of like to rephrase the last question I asked. Again, bearing in mind that many of the countries in the two regions we're working on are among what would be perceived as the skeptics here. Just to play the devil's advocate, we've been investing in access and benefit sharing. We've had our hopes on access and benefit sharing for a long time. It hasn't given rise to the monetary benefits that we had hoped it would. We're still we're not very good at making the case for the non-monetary benefits that it generates. Why keep pushing this? Why keep investing in it? Why not do something else entirely? I'm not sure what else that is. What do you say to those countries and those representatives who are coming to the table with that mindset?
I mean, it's a scientist's job to present data objectively. And although I'm not a lawyer, thank God, it is international law that the CBD exists, right? Or I didn't say that legally correct, but the CBD exists, right? There was a fundamental premise agreed to that to incentivize conservation and sustainable use in especially mega biodiverse countries or low and middle income countries, that there would be access and benefit sharing from those. It was supposed to create this positive feedback. That's an agreement that parties signed up to that countries have ratified. Can't undo that. And now countries come and say, hey, look, there's a loophole in this because of digital data and the combination of synthetic biology tools. They're not wrong. They're right. That's true. And so the ABS system has a loophole. And yeah, okay, so 0.1 for low and middle income countries if you want it. The question is, in the process of negotiations, whether or not both parties can meet in the middle and find reasonable things that doesn't come up with lose-lose outcomes for everybody. Because there's a real chance of doing that, right? Throw a super expensive high-tech tracking and tracing system at this mess. And all of a sudden, the only biodiversity that we can serve in the whole world is British, American, German, and Dutch, and Swedish DSI. Good for us, you know? So that's not a good solution. What we want to do is incentivize the use of Brazilian DSI. We want to incentivize the use of Algerian DSI, incentivize the use of Guatemalan DSI. And yeah, sure, have people pay in some smart way along the way and have those researchers have new opportunities that they never had before. But the question is whether or not parties are going to clash enough because the differences are so entrenched, or whether or not they can come together and say there's a middle ground here. It's informed by science, and we can find a way to do things that benefit both of us. I'm optimistic that there are ideas on the table, but they're really politically difficult to move forward because, yeah, of the legacy.
The other panelists like to address this issue, or do you want to pass it on?
I think one thing to say that you mentioned the word silo earlier on, and there is a huge risk of siloing different bits of our operation. So DSI is part of reaching biodiversity, sustainable use, CBD targets. It's part of that, it's not standalone. And I think we've got to look at this as a project, if you like. We're all used to designing projects. We're used to costing projects. We're used to looking for the outcomes of what we do and the outputs of what we do. And so far, this has not, to my mind, been applied to ABS at all. It's just been sat there. Oh, this is a way of generating benefits without clarity on how those benefits can be employed by the people they're being shared with, how they fit, how they help meet the countries, help them meet their targets as in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. We've just got to be better at designing what we do. And then I think the mechanisms might just fall out of that.
Okay, well, we have about 12 minutes left. I want to give all of you a chance to share reflections, make points that you wanted to make but didn't have a chance to make before. Things you're thinking of now that you would have liked to have said before when a question came up. and just to share some final thoughts with the, well, we've had 122 people at one point, with 100 people now online. So maybe we can just do a tour of the tab. Amber, you want to go first?
No, you really want me to go first? I don't have anything. I've already given all my juice out. What do you want me to say? No, man, it's a journey. I really actually feel like I've said all I wanted to say. My cheeks are flushed, my window's closed, you know? I mean, I think this is a moment for potential change, and either, you know, parties let their guards down and have some middle of the night conversation. I think the thing that I'm actually most scared about, Michael, is the pandemic conditions of negotiations. I think it actually keeps parties farther apart on such a difficult issue. And I really wish that there was room for truly informal. This is not informal, yeah? I'm informal by personality, but this is not informal, and even harder if you're truly representing a whole country in a negotiation. So I'm just deeply concerned that although I think that there is an opportunity to find a win-win solution here, and our group is committed to trying to provide a perspective on that, there's also a real risk for lose-lose. And I guess in terms of informalness, maybe the one plug that I could make, if you'll let me shamelessly do it, is that the DSI Scientific Network that's hosting this event is very, very open and welcoming to doing bilateral or to doing regional briefings. If we can go all the way back to the basics on DSI, or provide more detail on some of the publications that we've showed here today. And secondly, you know, if there are members or people, scientists out there that are interested in getting involved in ABS issues, that we would love to talk to more if you think this is a group that you'd like to participate in. So those two things I can also leave an open door for.
Sorry, I'm going to turn off my microphone. There's a coffee break about to take place behind me, which is another sign that we should be wrapping up quickly, but I'll turn my mic off, and Chris, Raquel, and Guy, last tour of reflections.
I'll just say briefly, because you've heard me talk a lot. I do, like Amber, think this is a time and a big opportunity. I think that we have, because of the pandemic and the lockdown and the ability to discuss live online, we've actually got greater opportunity, because I think maybe more people are engaged in this debate in more depth than might have been otherwise. I think a lot of people are thinking hard about issues to do with this. And yep, there's a risk. Of course there's a risk. There's always a risk. But I'd encourage everybody listening today to carry on thinking, carry on contributing. If you're not a negotiator, go find your negotiators and talk to them. We can do this. We can do this. And we should. That's it.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I would like to say that we have to learn about the experiences that we already have regarding the ABS system using biological material. So within these experiences, if we have had some difficulties, these difficulties reflect also the concern that we already have regarding DSI, because the concerns are exactly the same, because, or even more, no, because the procedure of complying with due diligence would be very similar. And but I would like to finish saying that the application of the ABS regime to DSI should be, in my point of view, should be more focused on commercial use, and it must be flexible when it comes to scientific research, even applied or basic research.
Thank you. I still have my microphone off as much as possible. It's getting very loud here.
So for me, just a few words then. I mean, much has been said, and there's not anything really specific to add. I mean, it's absolutely clear that there is great inequity in the world. It's not just about access and benefit sharing, of course, and biodiversity. It's about the impacts of climate change, which are felt very unevenly around the world and will be felt very unevenly. It's about global food supply. It's about the very disproportionate burden of infectious disease. It's about so many things. And while there is, I think, unfortunately, a tendency to pile all of those inequities into a single discussion that may at one time be about food supply and another time it will be about biodiversity, there is a tendency to do that. I still have some confidence. My confidence really comes from the fact that there is a win-win in here. There are many lose-lose situations, but there is at least one win-win. And we have in science, which I think is a very big part of that win, the scientific process. Science is a social activity. It's an activity that brings people together. And there's a great history of science, of really allowing people to work together, even across the most fractious political divides that history has served up for us. So I do think that enabling science around the world is a really key part of engaging properly around the world. And I think that's what gives me hope, and I think that's a pursuit that's well worth carrying on with. So I too would encourage the conversation. It's great that there are more questions and comments than we have time to answer, and I think we must all carry on talking.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I guess I get the final word. And I would like to take this opportunity first to thank the 4 panelists. I think you've done a great job. You've kept going for 2 hours. And I think it's been an interesting conversation. This is a conversation that we've all been engaged in for some time, and it's clear we're going to be engaged in for some time to come, including many of the people who've been participating and sharing actively through the chats and the questions and answers. Thanks very much to them as well. We all know each other, it seems. It's a community of people who spend an inordinate amount of time in each other's heads. And I guess it's going to continue that way for a while. Thanks very much for having invited me to chair this session. I've really enjoyed it. This is my first experience with the DSI network, and it's been a very positive one. So I'll join your network. And I look forward to more of the same. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.